Okay, so we left off at this model, and what I'd like to do now is implement the physical database using an RDBMS tool. The RDBMS tool that I'm going to choose right now will be Microsoft Access. Okay, so this is the initial design. Remember that at this stage, your development is iterative. So that means by the time I design the database in the RDBMS, I might have to come back, refine this, go back to the RDBMS and reflect the refinements in it, and go on. So what I'm going to do is label this as transactional. Oops, I just need my pen here. I guess the pen tool does not want to. Oh, I know what it is. I open this as a TIFF file instead of opening it with the tool. So this is this tool here, Sketchbook. And I'll open that file again. And let's see. So we're going to do open. And that was on the desktop. And that was the ERD trans. Okay, so sometimes a little mishaps like this. So now I can actually write in here. So I'm going to call this one transactional version 1. Okay, so it's my initial design, and there will be improvement to this as we move forward. So this will be our first iteration in the design process for this database. Again, let's go back and review what we did here. We have clients, okay? So we have an entity client that will eventually become a table that will keep records of clients that we have in our database. Now, we would like to assign clients to specific transactions on specific dates for a particular number of products. So to keep track of all of that, that particular order will have several line items where each line item will have one of these products described, again, in the entity product, which physically in a database will translate into a table that has records, or you might want to call them rows, of all these products as described by these attributes that you're seeing here. So each one of these entities will be technically a table, okay? And each one of these lines you're seeing inside the entities, or what we call attributes, okay, it will be a field name for the table. And each one of these will have a specific data type, and sometimes we may have to tweak the properties of some of these fields. So for example, client ID. Well, we have choices in how to make a client ID. Now, if you look at your driver license or your social security number, these are unique identifiers that identifies you as unique within that database, either at the DMV, right, Department of Motor Vehicle, or at Social Security, right? So no one else would have that number. Now, the format in which these client IDs or order IDs or product IDs are done could be custom in terms of, okay, well, if you look at your driver license, it might have letters and numbers. But if you look at your Social Security, it's purely numbers with a couple dashes. So that is up to the business on how to generate this. So for us, for example, we can simplify this by either having an integer value to identify a client, okay? Or we could have a string value, right? So it could be CL1, CL2, CL3, etc., as long as you assign CL1 to a specific client and no one else. The same thing with transactions. So the order IDs. Now, we may have tons of order IDs. So for each transaction, that would be very, how should I say, difficult to issue an order ID manually ourselves. So wouldn't it be nice if we have a system that actually assigns automatically an order ID as soon as we start an event that includes a transaction? And yes, there are mechanisms in place to do that. While in your design for the database, you could say the property for this one will be an auto number. That means every time you create a new record of transaction, just go ahead and issue a new integer value that we haven't used. And you could use an incrementation, like increment by 1 every time you add a new record. So that might be your algorithm. So so that means if you started with 1, the next one will be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, right? Now, if you delete a transaction, right, depending on your system, you may be allowed to reallocate that number back or just continue from that. It all depends how the auto number algorithm was written up, okay? Same thing with line item ID. So think about the scale of this. For each order ID, you may have 1 line item ID. You may have 2. You may have 15. You may have 1,000, depending, if you're an import-exporter, right? So this could get really, really, really out of control if you try to manually do this for the line item ID, the order ID. So we're going to automate these two. The product ID, that's interesting because it all depends, again, how do you identify these products, right? So if it's a car, it's a VIN number maybe. Or you could have even if the car has a VIN number, you may have a dealer ID for a particular vehicle in the inventory, okay? Totally, yes, it is related. So you may have another table that associate the VIN to that ID, something of that nature. But if it is something you generate, you could manually enter these product IDs, especially if you don't have, a plethora or a huge selection of products. Or if your products are pretty static, so any product ID that you can make unique manually will be fine. Otherwise, an auto number will be just fine. Okay. So the same with clients. So now if you have clients signing in online, right, and they're creating an account for themselves and, so you have no chance yourself as the administrator of this database to assign an ID unless you have some sort of a procedure that says, we'll get back to you in 24 hours after we approve your registration and so on and so forth. Then, yeah, you could assign an ID yourself. Otherwise, you want to automate the process. So a client ID as an auto number might be a good idea too, in case you put this database online and you allow for clients to log in and or set up new accounts, and you want to generate that on the fly. So these are some of the encounters. Your first challenges in terms of choosing what data type and what properties your fields should have. Other things we might look at here is your first name and last name. Well, those are going to be strings. Now, depending on your RDBMS system, if it's an Oracle, it would be a varchar, so a number of characters, how many? Varchar 20, whatever you want. There are variations of varchar. You might see varchar 220, something like that. If it's Access, it will be a text field that defaults to 255 characters. Otherwise, you can shrink it in case you know that field shouldn't be more than 5 or 10 characters. So you could set the rules again on how to do that. So you're going to have to trap the error in case something wrong happens, okay? All right, so same thing, order date. If you notice here, this is there such a thing as a date format? And the answer is yes. Most RDBMSs will support a date format. Okay. Quantity, for example, in the line item, well, that will be an integer. Product ID here and product ID here, or order ID here and order ID and client ID and client ID. Now, this where you may get into a dilemma. What data type should a foreign key be if a primary key is of a particular data type? Well, the answer is they should both be of the same data type. So if your client ID is an integer, then your client ID as a foreign key should be an integer. If your order ID as a primary key is an integer as well, then your order ID in the line items referencing to transactions as a foreign key should also be an integer. Now, I mentioned something about auto numbers. And, well, an auto number is really an integer. So you could have an integer order ID in the transactions as an auto number. However, The foreign key should never be an auto number. You're not generating a number, okay, at that stage. Only the primary key you would, for example, do an auto number. So let's get busy with the actual database design and see how these challenges comes into play. So let me just get to my virtual machine in Windows here, and I'm going to start Microsoft Access. Now, notice here I have two variations of it. You could choose whichever. So I'm just going to go for this one. Okay, let me bring my keyboard down here. As you can see, I have the choice for a blank database, and that is indeed what I'm going to do. I'm going to pick a blank database. It's going to ask me, what do you want to call it? I'm going to call it Transaction version 1. Okay. Where do you want to save it? And I'm going to go over here and I'm going to say under desktop. Usually I have a directory where I save my stuff here. It will be under database. So you can see I prepared already a directory for this. I'm going to call it Transactional version 1 right here. So I'm going to say OK. And I'm going to hit create. Okay. Right. So let me just maximize this. And just to show you, if you go over here and you go to the desktop and you go to code testing, you would see that under database, right here, databases, transactional version 1, I have an access database already there. Okay, created and modified on this date. Okay, that is today. Let me see. Yeah, today is daylight saving time. So it caught up with that, so that's not a problem. Okay, so now notice that the first thing it does, it creates an actual table, a default table called table 1. Okay, we're going to rename this and actually make it more to reflect more our design, the ERD. So we're going to start with the client. So the way to do this, you're going to go over here on the left upper hand side where it says view here. Now you see this this pencil here and the triangle in here. So, and a ruler and so on. So that's your design view. So I'm going to click on it. Okay, right here for this table. Click here. And as you can see, it's asking me to save the table. And I'm going to call it client. Okay. As soon as I do that, it goes into this view, which allows me to actually enter the field names, right, or the attributes of this entity. And if you look at here, what I want at minimum is client ID, first name and last name. And notice that it automatically puts a key here. That is a primary key. Now I could turn it on or off like this by hitting this primary key here. And notice it automatically sets it to auto number. Now, if I click here, I have choices of data types right here. I'm going to leave it as an auto number and not just call it ID. I'm going to call it client ID. Let me just lowercase the client here, client ID, and under description, you could type PK here. This will have no effect on your database other than a comment next to what you're doing over here. And then here, we're going to put the first name so that our next attribute is first name. Next attribute is last name. So first name. Now, some people like to put a space in between these. When you're naming a field like this, is fine in most modern databases. If you had an older system, it's probably a good idea to either join them like this or put an underscore. Okay, especially if you have to exchange some of these tables or export them to another database that does not support a space for a field name between two words. Okay, so always a good idea to do that. And notice here it automatically takes it in as a short text. Again, if you click here, you could see I have a whole set of data types that I could choose. I'm just going to leave it as a short text. If you go below here, it shows you that it's 255 characters for that field. We have a whole bunch of other properties below here, including here, if I click on this ear here, more controls over here. So again, we will get back to this once we improve this design. Once we do certain things like validation rules, uniqueness of the field, all sorts of fine tuning that we may need for any of the fields or any of the attributes for this database. So at this stage, I'm just going to keep it as simple as possible, just take in the default settings that the RDBMS throws at me. Okay, so next is last name, okay, and leave that also as a short text. Okay, so I'm good with that. That's pretty much what I have here, client ID, last name. So hit save. Okay, all right, so and if I click on this to see what view do I have, notice now I have a table that looks like an Excel spreadsheet, and that's got columns, right? It's got client ID, first name, last name, right? So you can actually enter some clients here, right? So for example, let me enter myself here, and under last name, something like this, right? Notice it automatically assigned me an ID of 1. Okay, so can I add more records? Absolutely. You could go ahead and do something like this, Henry, and then forward over here, right? Oops. You can go ahead and add more clients if you want. John, and this would be Glenn here, okay, etc., right? So Jane Goodall, etc., right? I'm not sure if I spelled her first name correctly, but got the picture here. It's easy. As you can see, you have a field for first name, you have a field for last name, and the ID is automatically generated. That's what the auto number is for. So I have less of a field to track or to update at any time. It's done for me if your business permits that. Should your ID be unique or you have to enter them as a policy, then you're going to have to remove that auto number and leave it either as an integer or a string, which could be a combination of numbers and characters, okay? So we have client. Great. How about creating another one for product, okay? Okay, so way to do this. Do you see where it says create? You're going to go to create, okay? And it's got a little, it's got a whole bunch of create tools here. So tables, queries, forms, right? Reports. This is typical to Microsoft Access from its inception. It always had these 3 items, or these 4 items: table, query, form, and report. So, and with that, it's got different variations of or subtools on how to design this. Okay. For our case at this stage, we're simply going to click on table because we're creating a new entity. So I'm going to go over here. Notice it creates another tab here. My client is still on. You can turn it off. That means I can go over here, close it, so it's not interfering with what I'm doing. Click here again. Notice initially it calls it table 1. Change it to product. Product. Okay. So that is the product table. And notice here, again, it has an auto number. You could leave it as an auto number. You could put an ID for the product if you want. Let's not do an auto number for product, okay? Let's do something like this, product ID. And let's make it a string, which means you have to enter the product every time you get it in your database, right? And that is okay if you have a limited spectrum of products, which will be fine. So short text is fine. Short text is 255 characters, okay? So we're good. Description for the product, okay? Short text will be fine, okay? Or you could call it product name, okay? Oops, product name, underscore name, okay? You could say a description here. Now, for the description, you could leave it as a short text. You could also, some people might write a whole paragraph of things, and in that case, you might want to go to, let's see here, either long text or memo. I don't think this version anymore supports memo, but at one time, Microsoft Access had a field called memo, okay? But if I go to long text, let's see, then you could do something like that where you can actually enter more I'm not sure if I could see here the restriction, how much data or how many characters you can put in. It doesn't say anything here, but it does have a format. Let's click on it for a second, just for curiosity. I don't see anything here. Again, you could press F1 to see what kind of formats are available for that. I am going to just leave it as a long text. That's fine. And then, how about price? Okay, so unit price. Now, in here, we have currency. So you could actually assign it a currency. Now, that's going to default to dollars. Unless you want to change it to something else, again, you're going to have to go to the properties here, and we could do that. Okay. So for now, we're just going to leave it the way it is, currency. Let's see, what other fields are we missing? Unit price. Notice I added another one, which is product name, right? Description, unit price. Okay. Quantity on hand might be a good idea, but you're going to have to run a query against it to update it at all times. So every time there's a purchase, then the quantity on hand will have to be modified. We'll leave that for another version to make it more interesting. So for now, I'm going to keep it this way. So I'm going to have to go ahead and save this. Great. Now, as you can see, here are my products. Okay. So I could have a product ID, Gizmo 100. Right. So as you can see, because I have a text, so I can actually enter whatever I want. And that would be product name would be PlayStation or Play Platform. Description, video game, something like this. And then the price maybe $200. Okay. Oops, that's $2,000. That would be an expensive one. Let's say you have another one. Gizmo 200. This would be probably, let's say, a joystick. And that would be description, game interface. Okay, we're going to do it at $30. Okay, something like that. So let's say that's what I'm selling. Okay, right. So I can keep going, but you have to make sure that this one here is unique. Now watch what happens if I do this. Gizmo 200 again. Okay, and I type whatever, right? So whatever price is, I don't care, 100. Now I try to move my mouse to the next record, and then I get an error. That's good, because the RDBMS, what it's doing, when I say RDBMS, by the way, folks, it means Relational Database Management System. It's picking up an error and says, okay, you've designed the product ID as a unique key. Why are you trying to enter a number that already exists or a value that already exists? That's what it's saying. Okay, so we can't have this. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this if it allows me to do things. So I'm just going to delete, or simply close this. Hopefully it won't save it. Yes. So let me just open it again. Okay, perfect. So it didn't save it for me. So we have product. It's got 2 items. We have clients. It's got 4 people. Okay. We can close all. Okay. Now we're going to go ahead and design the transaction and the line item. So let's start with the transaction entity or table. Okay. To do this, again, you go to create, and you're going to create table, and you're going to go to design, and you're going to call this one transaction. Okay. Now, some people might make them plural, like clients, products, transactions. Okay. So the transaction ID, I'm going to leave it as an order number, as I said. Otherwise, you're going to run out. It's going to run out of your hands. Okay. So you're going to lose control. So trans ID, I'm going to leave it that way. This would be a PK here. Okay, so I need a foreign key, client ID. Now remember, my client ID in the primary table was an auto number. So in this case here, it should be simply a number. And just write FK for foreign key here. Okay, excellent. So now what else? Well, we need a date. when was this transaction done, right? Okay. So you could type simply date right here and pick, and so it's saying you can't do this because it's a unique name, all right? So I'm going to say, okay, you could leave it the way it is, but it's just giving you a warning. So I'm going to call it transaction date. So that way I don't get these errors again. There you go. So no problem here. So now, under this one, I'm just going to go ahead and say date and time. Okay. If you want to make this interesting, save the table at this stage like this, and then go to the input mask right here under the properties. Click on this button that has 3 dots on it. And notice here it's got variations of the date formats that you could pick. I'm going to pick short date and just hit finish. So that means anytime I get into that field, it will automatically format that field as a short date. Okay. So let's look at what else we have. So we have order ID, client ID, order date. So I've got the 3 fields. And again, we might find out later on that I need more fields. Remember, this design process is iterative. So this is our initial start to it, and then we'll see what happens afterward. So I'm going to save this again and close it. So I don't need it, so close it. And next is line item. So I'm going to go ahead and design line item. So just again, go to create, go to table. Notice it automatically creates a table for me. However, I want this to be, okay, so let's just type home here. I want this to be called line item as a table. Okay, so I'm going to go over here. And again, this would be line item ID and leave it as an order number. Okay, and so that's that field right here as your primary key. Okay, excellent. So we need order ID and product ID as foreign keys. So let's do those first. So the order in which you put things isn't that important. It all depends how you're going to insert data later on. Okay, so order ID, this would be a foreign key. Remember, it was an auto number. So this has to be a number. Remember, this one is a primary key. This one is a foreign key. Okay. What else? We have a product ID. Now, product ID was a string. So make sure that this one also is a short text. And again, this is a foreign key. Okay. Excellent. So what else? Well, this will link them all together. Now, we need to know how much of those products did you buy? Okay. Quantity. Okay. So for that particular product, for that particular order line, we want a quantity here. Now, this quantity is simply going to be a number right here that we could use, right? Because we're going to do some math with that in our queries, an aggregate query that figures out, okay, so what's the total, right? So in case we want to print an invoice, so we could use that to generate an invoice. Perfect. So let's save this and let's close this. And let's see now how these tables are related to each other. And the way to do this is you're going to go to Database Tools, okay? And where you see relationships here, you're going to click on that. And notice it automatically shows this window here where you could select the tables that you want to create the relationships between them, just like we did here. This will enforce the referential integrity between these records. So let's go ahead and do this, or these relations. So I'm going to add all of them. So what I did is I held the shift key and clicked on the last one. So I'm going to add all these tables here and close. Okay. I'm going to make it look like my drawing. So I'm just going to move line item over here. And I'm going to move client over here. And then watch what I do, how I create the relationship. I'm going to take client ID and move it here and match it out to client ID here. And notice it automatically assigns client ID to client ID. Enforce referential integrity. Do this so you can actually see that you're going to get a one-to-many relationship. And sure enough, if you look carefully here, I have a 1 and infinity. Now, infinity is what Microsoft uses as their symbol for many. Next, we're going to do the same thing with product ID and line item. So I'm just going to move the product ID to product ID and enforce referential integrity, create. Now we're going to take the trans ID, and even though I called it order ID here, but they're the same thing. Notice it's called trans ID here and order ID. It's the same. So your primary key and foreign key, as a lesson, do not have to have the same name, as long as they're of the same data type and they reference each other. And then hit enforce referential integrity, create, and as you can see, not a problem. The RDBMS understood that the relationship between transaction and line item is a one-to-many. Okay, on that, we conclude this stage where now you can see that the prototype is ready to go. And the next video, we're going to populate this database with some data to make sure that we don't have any anomalies. And then we'll start improving this database as we move forward. Thank you.